Sometimes, the hardest battles we fight aren't against enemies, but against the parts of ourselves we're trying to forget. Sometimes redemption comes from the most unexpected places, when we least deserve it, but need it most. Up in Montana's mountains lived an old mountain man named Lije Calder. After the war, he went high into the wilderness to escape his past. Most folks figured he'd die alone up there. One cold evening, while tracking elk, Lije found a massive grizzly bear caught in a steel trap. The bear was bleeding and dying, but its eyes held no anger, just pain and a quiet acceptance that touched something deep in the old man's heart. Lije could have walked away, should have walked away, but something about that bear's suffering reminded him of his own wounds. What would you do if saving another creature meant facing everything you've been running from? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The snow had been falling for 3 days straight when Lije Calder first heard the sound that would change everything. It wasn't much, just a low, mournful cry carried on the wind through the pines. But after 15 years of mountain silence, a man learns to pay attention to sounds that don't belong. Lije paused in his wood splitting, the worn handle of his grandfather's axe warm in his calloused hands. At 62, his hair had gone the color of winter clouds, and deep lines mapped the territory around his pale blue eyes, like creek beds carved by decades of weather and worry. The war in Vietnam had ended more than 40 years ago, but some battles never truly finish. They just move inside a man and set up camp in the quiet spaces where memories live. His cabin sat at 8,000 feet, tucked into a grove of lodgepole pines that had somehow survived the fires and windstorms that periodically swept through the Bitterroot Range. He built it himself, log by log, using skills his father had taught him before the world went sideways. The structure was simple, but solid 20 by 30 feet of hand-hewn timber, with a stone fireplace that drew clean and a roof pitched steep enough to shed the heavy mountain snows. The sound came again, fainter this time, but unmistakably the voice of something in distress. Lije set down his axe and walked to the edge of his clearing, boots crunching through snow that came up past his ankles. The wind had died to nothing, leaving the forest wrapped in that peculiar stillness that comes with heavy snowfall. Each flake drifted down like a small prayer, adding to the white blanket that covered everything in sight. He'd chosen this place precisely because it was far from people and their complications. The nearest neighbor was Jake Morrison, a retired logger who lived 12 miles down the mountain and respected the unspoken agreement that some men needed their solitude. The closest town, Darby, might as well have been on another planet for all the contact Lije had with it. He made a supply run twice a year, once in late spring after the snow cleared, and again in early fall before winter locked the high country away from the world below. The arrangement suited him fine. He had his books, his woodworking, and the endless tasks that came with mountain living. There was firewood to cut and stack, meat to hunt and preserve, repairs to make before the weather turned nasty. He kept a small garden in the brief growing season, growing potatoes and turnips and the hardy greens that could handle the short summers. His needs were simple, and solitude had become not just a preference, but a necessity. But that sound, it pulled at something in his chest he'd thought was long buried. Lije went back into the cabin and reached for his rifle, a well-maintained Winchester that had belonged to his father. The weapon was old but reliable, and he'd used it to take deer and elk over the years when his meat supplies ran low. He checked the chamber out of habit, then pulled on his heavy wool coat and stepped back into the falling snow. The cry had come from the northeast, up toward the high ridge where an old logging road snaked through the timber. Lije knew every game trail and creek bed within 10 miles of his cabin, could navigate the terrain in darkness or blizzard conditions. He'd spent enough time in these mountains to read the landscape like a well-worn book. As he walked, his thoughts drifted to the early days after he'd returned from Southeast Asia. The transition back to civilian life had been rougher than he'd expected. The young man who'd left Montana full of patriotic fire had come home carrying invisible wounds that seemed to fester rather than heal. He tried living in town, even held a job at the lumber mill for a few months, but the noise and crowds had made his skin crawl. Too many people asking questions he couldn't answer, offering sympathy he didn't want. The mountains had called to him then, promising space and silence and the kind of peace that could only come from removing yourself from a world that no longer made sense. He'd sold everything he owned, except his truck and a few personal belongings, bought this isolated patch of land with his savings, and started building a life that fit the shape of his damaged soul. The years had passed quietly. Seasons rolled into seasons with the reliable rhythm of snow and thaw, growth and dormancy. He'd learned to can vegetables, smoke meat, and repair just about anything that could break. His hands had grown skilled at woodworking, and he'd furnished his cabin with simple, sturdy pieces cut from local timber. There was satisfaction in creating something useful with your own hands, something that would last long after you were gone. He'd also learned to live with the ghosts. They visited less frequently now, but they still came, usually in the deep of night when sleep thinned, and memories leaked through the cracks in his carefully constructed defenses. Names and faces from the jungle, men who'd never made it home, decisions that had saved some lives and cost others. The weight of command in a war that had made no sense to anyone who'd fought it. The sound came again, closer now, and Lije picked up his pace. Whatever was making that noise was in serious trouble. He'd heard wounded animals before, the keening cry of an injured deer, the desperate bellow of an elk caught in a deadfall. But this was different. There was something almost human in the anguish, a quality that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The old logging road appeared through the trees, its path marked by stumps and the occasional piece of rusted equipment left behind when the timber company had moved on 20 years ago. Snow had drifted across the roadway, creating soft sculptures that rose and fell like frozen waves. Lije moved carefully, his boots finding purchase on the uneven ground beneath the snow. He'd gone maybe a quarter mile when he saw the tracks. They were fresh, made within the last few hours before the snow had started falling heavily. Boot prints. Human-sized but wrong somehow to deep in places, suggesting someone carrying a heavy load. They followed the logging road for 100 yards before veering off into the timber. Lije knelt beside the clearest print, studying the pattern pressed into the snow. The tread was distinctive, expensive hiking boots, probably bought in some sporting goods store in Missoula or Billings. Not the kind of footwear a local would choose for serious mountain work. The tracks belonged to someone who didn't know these hills, someone who had business here that likely involved more than admiring the scenery. Poachers. Lije had encountered them before, though not often at this altitude or this time of year. Most were after elk or deer, looking to fill their freezers without paying for licenses or following hunting seasons. Some were trophy hunters willing to pay good money for an impressive rack of antlers. A few were just knuckleheads who thought the rules didn't apply to them. But the cry he'd been hearing wasn't coming from a human throat. He followed the tracks into the trees, moving with the careful quiet he'd learned in the jungle. The snow muffled his footsteps, but he placed each boot deliberately, avoiding branches that might snap or rocks that might shift. Whatever lay ahead, he wanted to approach it on his own terms. The tracks led uphill through dense timber, winding around deadfalls and granite outcroppings. Whoever had made them had been in a hurry, taking the most direct route rather than following the easier paths a local would have chosen. The boot prints were joined by drag marks, now long furrows in the snow that suggested something heavy being pulled or hauled. That's when Lije heard it clearly for the first time, not the distant cry carried on the wind, but the actual sound itself. It was a low, rumbling moan filled with pain and exhaustion, the voice of something large and wild and trapped. He moved faster now, following the obvious trail through the trees. The snow was lighter under the canopy, allowing him to see more clearly. Fresh broken branches marked the path, and there were spots where the snow had been churned up by some kind of struggle. The tracks led to a small clearing where an old snag had fallen, creating a natural shelter between its massive trunk and a granite boulder. And there, in the shadow of that fallen tree, Lije found what he'd been looking for. The grizzly was enormous, probably close to 700 pounds of muscle and bone and thick winter fur. But size meant nothing when steel held you fast. The bear was caught in a trap unlike anything Lije had seen before, not the simple leg-hold traps used for smaller game, but a massive contraption of cables and springs designed to hold something this size. A heavy chain connected the trap to a steel stake driven deep into the frozen ground. The great bear lay on its side, breathing heavily, steam rising from its massive frame in the cold air. One hind leg was caught in the trap's jaws, and the fur around the steel was dark with blood. The animal's eyes, small and dark and intelligent, tracked Lije's approach with no fear, only a kind of resigned acceptance that broke something loose in the old man's chest. Lije stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, his rifle forgotten in his hands. The bear's gaze held him like a physical weight, and for a moment that stretched longer than it should have, man and animal regarded each other across 20 feet of trampled snow. There was no aggression in those dark eyes, no challenge or threat, just pain and something that looked remarkably like understanding. The trap was a professional piece of work, not the crude contraption of some weekend poacher, but a carefully engineered device designed by someone who knew exactly what they were hunting. Heavy steel cables formed the main structure, connected to powerful springs that had snapped shut with enough force to break bone. The chain that anchored it to the ground was thick as a man's thumb, secured with a stake that had been driven so deep into the frozen earth that only a few inches showed. Above the snow, blood had pooled beneath the bear's trapped leg, melting the snow into pink slush that steamed in the cold air. The animal had clearly been fighting the trap for hours, maybe longer. Deep gouges in the ground show where massive claws had torn at the earth. Bark had been stripped from nearby trees, where the bear had tried to use them for leverage. But the trap had been built to hold creatures far stronger than any man, and all a bear's struggles had accomplished was to make the steel bite deeper. Lije took a careful step closer, and the grizzly's head lifted slightly. A low rumble came from its throat, not quite a growl, more like a question. The sound reminded him of something, though he couldn't place what. He stopped moving and let the bear study him, noting the way its ears weren't laid back against its skull, how its mouth remained closed despite obvious pain. This wasn't an animal preparing to attack. This was a creature that had moved beyond rage into something approaching resignation. The smart thing would be to walk away. Any reasonable person would put as much distance as possible between themselves and a trapped grizzly, then maybe call the wildlife authorities when they got back to civilization. Let the professionals handle it. Bears were dangerous under the best circumstances, and a wounded, trapped bear was a recipe for disaster. Lije had seen what these animals could do, had found the remains of a hiker 3 years back who'd gotten too close to a sow with cubs. But something about the scene held him rooted in place. Maybe it was the bear's eyes, which seemed too knowing for a wild animal. Maybe it was the careful, almost surgical precision of the trap, which spoke of planning and cruelty that made his stomach turn. Or maybe it was something simpler, the recognition of suffering in another living thing, and the memory of what it felt like to be caught in a trap of your own making with no way out. The war had taught him about traps, not just the obvious ones, the buried mines and concealed pits that could tear a man apart, but the invisible snares that caught your mind and soul. The trap of orders that made no sense but had to be followed. The trap of watching good men die for reasons that seemed less clear with each passing day. The trap of coming home to a country that didn't want to hear about what you'd seen and done in their name. He'd been caught in steel of a different sort, and it had taken him 15 years of mountain solitude to even begin cutting himself free. The process was ongoing, might always be ongoing. Some wounds never fully healed, but sometimes they could be managed, lived with, incorporated into a life that still had meaning. The bear made another sound, softer this time, almost conversational. Its massive head sank back to the snow, but those dark eyes never left Lije's face, waiting, watching, trusting, somehow, that this strange two-legged creature might be different from the ones who had set the trap. Lije set his rifle against a nearby tree and moved closer. The bear tensed slightly, but didn't try to move. Up close, the damage was worse than he'd thought. The trap had closed just above the ankle joint, crushing bone and tearing muscle. Blood had matted the thick fur into dark spikes, and he could see where the steel had worn raw channels in the animal's hide. The bear had to be in agony, but it lay still as death except for the steady rise and fall of its ribcage. "Easy there, old fellow," Lije heard himself say, his voice rusty from disuse. "Let's have a look at what they did to you." The trap mechanism was more complex than anything he'd encountered. Most snares worked on simple principle spring-loaded jaws that snapped shut when pressure was applied to a trigger plate. But this device had multiple moving parts, safety catches, and what looked like a timing mechanism. Someone had spent serious money and effort to build something that would hold a grizzly bear indefinitely without killing it. That realization made ice form in Lije's gut. This wasn't about poaching for meat or trophy hunting. This trap was designed to keep the bear alive, which meant whoever had set it planned to come back. And people who wanted live bears usually weren't interested in admiring them from a distance. The illegal wildlife trade was a multi-million-dollar business. Bear bile was worth more than gold in certain Asian markets, prized for its supposed medicinal properties. Gallbladders could sell for thousands of dollars each. Claws and teeth found their way into jewelry and traditional medicines. And live bears, especially grizzlies, were valuable for private hunting preserves where wealthy clients paid enormous sums to shoot canned animals in enclosed spaces. The thought of this magnificent creature ending up in some rich man's private killing ground made something dark and familiar stir in Lije's chest. It was a feeling he'd worked hard to bury, the cold rage that had once made him very good at a job he'd spent decades trying to forget. He'd killed men in the jungle, not in clean firefights where the enemy was clearly marked, but in night raids, an ambush where the lines between right and wrong blurred like smoke in the rain. He'd been good at it. Too good. And that talent had eaten at him for years after he came home. A corruption in his soul that had driven him up into these mountains where he couldn't hurt anyone else. But looking at the trapped bear, feeling the weight of its trust and pain, Lije found himself remembering something else about those dark days in Southeast Asia. Not just the killing, but the times when he'd used his skills to protect instead of destroy. Missions where his unit had pulled down pilots out of enemy territory. Operations that had saved villages from being overrun. The satisfaction that came from using hard-won abilities for something other than death. The bear's breathing had grown. More labored. Shock was setting in, and if the animal didn't get help soon, it would die regardless of anyone's plans for it. Blood loss, hypothermia, and infection would finish what the trap had started. Lije knelt in the snow beside the massive head. The bear's eyes tracked his movement, but it made no attempt to bite or claw. At this distance, he could see the individual whiskers on its muzzle, the way its nostrils flared with each breath. The animal smelled like pine needles and clean snow, wild and untainted by the concerns of men. "I don't know if you can understand me," Lije said quietly, "but I'm going to try to get you out of there." It's going to hurt, and you might decide to take a piece out of me for my trouble. But I've been where you are, caught in something you didn't see coming, held fast by steel you can't break. Nobody should have to die that way." He reached out slowly, carefully, and placed his hand on the bear's massive shoulder. The fur was incredibly thick, probably 6 inches deep, designed to keep the animal warm through mountain winters that could kill a man in hours. Beneath the fur, he could feel the heat of the bear's body, the steady thrum of its heartbeat. Muscle, corded like iron cables under the skin, power that could snap a man's neck with casual ease. But the bear lay still under his touch, and Lije felt something pass between them, not friendship exactly, but a kind of recognition. Two creatures who had seen too much, endured too much, and somehow found themselves in this moment when neither was what the other expected. Lije stood and moved to examine the trap more closely. The mechanism was sophisticated, but all machines had weaknesses. The trick was finding the right place to apply pressure, the critical component that would cause the whole system to fail. He'd learned about such things in the army, though the traps he'd dealt with then had been designed to kill, not capture. The snow was falling harder now, fat flakes that stuck to his jacket and melted against his skin. Soon the clearing would be white again, covering the signs of struggle and suffering. By tomorrow, unless someone knew exactly where to look, there would be no evidence that anything had happened here. That thought crystallized his decision. Whoever had set this trap would be back, probably within the next day or two. They'd find their prize exactly as they'd left it, if they were lucky. If they were unlucky, they'd find Lije waiting for him instead. But first, he had a bear to free. He went back to where he'd left his rifle and pulled a knife from his belt. It was a good blade, sharp enough to shave with and strong enough to cut through leather or rope. Whether it be sufficient for steel cable remained to be seen. The bear watched him approach, its eyes reflecting an intelligence that seemed almost human. When Lije knelt beside the trap and began examining the mechanism, the animal actually lifted its trapped leg slightly, as if trying to help. "That's it," Lije murmured. "We'll figure this out together." He found what he was looking for, a series of small bolts that held the mainspring mechanism together. If he could remove them, the trap's jaws should open enough to free the bear's leg. The bolts were tight, set with thread locker compound to prevent them from working loose. But Lije had tools back at his cabin, and more importantly, he had time. The poachers weren't expecting anyone to find their trap. This high in the mountains, in the middle of winter, most people had more sense than to go wandering around in a blizzard. They'd set their snare and gone back to whatever warm place they were calling home, confident that their prize would be waiting when they returned. They'd made one critical mistake, though. They'd assumed that no one lived up here, that the mountains were empty of everything but animals. They hadn't counted on a damaged old soldier who'd come to the high country to find peace and instead found something that needed saving. Lije looked into the bear's eyes one more time, seeing something there that looked remarkably like hope. "Hold on," he said. "I'll be back." The journey back to his cabin took twice as long as usual. The snow was falling heavier now, and Lije found himself breaking trail through drifts that came up to his knees. But his mind wasn't on the weather or the difficult footing. Instead, he was cataloging everything he'd need to free the bear, running through possible complications and backup plans with the methodical precision that had once kept him alive in hostile territory. The old toolbox sat on a shelf in his workshop, a battered metal container that had belonged to his father and grandfather. Before him, Lije pulled it down and opened the lid, breathing in the familiar smell of machine oil and steel. Inside were the tools that had built this cabin and maintained it through 15 years of mountain winters: wrenches and pliers, screwdrivers, and punches, each one worn smooth by generations of Calder hands. He selected what he needed: a set of socket wrenches, bolt cutters that might handle the trap's cables, and his battery-powered drill with a selection of metal bits. The drill was a concession to modern convenience he'd make grudgingly, but living alone in the mountains sometimes required practical compromises. If the manual tools failed, electric power might give him the edge he needed. While gathering his equipment, Lije found himself thinking about the bear's eyes. There had been something there beyond simple animal intelligence, a quality of awareness that suggested the creature understood more than it should. He'd seen similar expressions on the faces of wounded soldiers, men who'd been pushed beyond their limits but somehow found the strength to endure. The bear had that same look of quiet courage, of refusing to give up even when the situation seemed hopeless. It reminded him of Tommy Nguyen, a young soldier who'd served under his command during the war. Tommy had stepped on a mine during a patrol in the Mekong Delta, losing his left leg below the knee. While they waited for the medevac chopper, the kid had looked up at Lije with that same expression, pain and fear. Yes, but also a fierce determination not to let the wound define him. Tommy had survived, gone home to California, and according to the last letter Lije had received, was teaching high school mathematics and coaching track. Some wounds could be healed, some traps could be escaped. The trick was knowing which ones were worth fighting and which ones you had to accept. Lije loaded his tools into a canvas pack, along with a first aid kit and a thermos of hot coffee. The bear would need medical attention once it was free, assuming he could actually get the trap open. The damaged leg would require cleaning and bandaging, and there was always the risk of infection. He'd treated wounded animals before, mostly deer and elk that had been hit by cars or caught in barbed wire, but never anything as large or potentially dangerous as a grizzly. The storm was intensifying as he left the cabin. Wind drove the snow sideways through the trees, reducing visibility to a few yards and making the forest feel claustrophobic. Lije pulled his knit cap down over his ears and adjusted the pack on his shoulders. The weight of the tools felt reassuring, familiar. He'd carried heavier loads through worse conditions, though admittedly not at his current age. 62 wasn't old by modern standards, but mountain living added years to a man's body that didn't show on paper. His knees creaked when he stood up too fast, and his back sometimes reminded him of old injuries with sharp stabs of pain. But his hands were still steady, his mind still sharp, and his endurance was probably better than most men half his age. The mountains had taken their toll, but they'd also given him strength. The trail back to the clearing was already filling with fresh snow, but Lije's earlier passage had packed the route enough to make walking easier. He moved at a steady pace, conserving energy for the work ahead. The trapped bear would be weaker now, possibly going into shock from blood loss and exposure. Every minute mattered. He thought about the poachers as he walked, trying to understand their operation. The trap was expensive and sophisticated, which suggested professionals rather than opportunistic amateurs. They'd scouted the area carefully, choosing a location that was remote but accessible by the old logging road. They knew the local wildlife patterns well enough to place their snare where a bear would naturally travel. That level of planning meant this wasn't their first operation in the area. They'd probably been working these mountains for months, maybe years, taking animals that wouldn't be missed until hunting season revealed the declining populations. Game wardens were spread thin across thousands of square miles of wilderness, and poachers who knew what they were doing could operate for years without detection. The illegal wildlife trade was like any other criminal enterprise it followed. The money. A live grizzly bear could be worth $50,000 or more to the right buyer. Dead, the parts might bring in another $20,000. For people without moral constraints, those numbers made the risks worthwhile. But they'd made a mistake choosing this particular valley. They'd assumed the high country was empty, that no one would stumble across their operation before they could completed. They hadn't counted on an old soldier who'd chosen these mountains, precisely because they were supposed to be far from human complications. Lije reached the clearing just as the wind died down, leaving the forest wrapped in an eerie quiet. Snow continued to fall, but straight down now, each flake settling with gentle precision. The bear was exactly where he'd left it, lying on its side beside the fallen log. But something had changed. The great head lifted as he approached, and Lije saw alertness in those dark eyes that hadn't been there before. The bear had used the time to rest, to gather its strength. When it saw him returning with the pack of tools, it made a soft chuffing sound that might have been greeting or gratitude. "Still with me, are you?" Lije said, settling the pack in the snow. "Good. We've got work to do." He knelt beside the trap and began examining the mechanism more closely. In the better light from his flashlight, he could see that the device was even more sophisticated than he'd first thought. The main springs were housed in protective casings to prevent tampering, and the release mechanism was secured with tamper-evident seals. Whoever had built this trap had experience with people trying to free their captors, but every system had vulnerabilities. Lije had learned that lesson in demolitions training, where understanding how things were built was the first step in learning how to take them apart. The trap's strength came from its integrated design, multiple springs working together to maintain constant pressure on the jaws. If he could disable just one of the spring assemblies, the remaining pressure might be weak enough for the bear to break free on its own. He selected a socket wrench and began working on the first access panel. The bolts were tight, set with industrial thread locker, but they weren't welded. With patience and steady pressure, they could be removed. The bear watched his efforts with what seemed like fascination, occasionally shifting position to give him better access to the trap. The first bolt came free with a sharp crack that echoed through the clearing. The bear's ears twitched at the sound, but it remained calm. Lije moved to the next bolt, working methodically despite the cold that was making his fingers stiff. Each piece of hardware that came free brought them closer to freedom, closer to escaping the steel trap that had been meant to hold until the poachers returned. Snow had begun to accumulate on his shoulders and the bear's fur, adding another layer of insulation against the cold. The storm was providing cover for their escape attempt, hiding their activities from anyone who might be watching. By the time the weather cleared, they would be long gone from this place if they succeeded, if the trap could be opened, if the bear's injuries weren't too severe for it to travel. Too many variables, too many things that could go wrong. But Lije had operated in uncertain situations before, had learned to focus on what he could control while preparing for what he couldn't. Right now, he could work on the trap. Everything else would have to take care of itself. The second bolt loosened, then the third. With each piece of hardware he removed, Lije felt the satisfaction that came from solving a complex problem through patience and skill. The trap had been designed by intelligent people, but intelligence could be matched by experience and determination. He glanced at the bear, noting how the animal's breathing had steadied. The great creature seemed to understand that help was coming, that the steel jaws that had held it for hours were finally beginning to lose their grip. "Almost there," Lije murmured, more to himself than to the bear. "Just a few more pieces, and we'll have you out of there." The wind picked up again, sending snow swirling through the clearing like ghosts dancing between the trees. But in the shelter of the fallen log, man and bear continued their quiet collaboration, working together toward freedom with the patience that comes from understanding that some victories are worth waiting for. Asterisk. The fourth bolt fought him. Corrosion had welded it to the threads despite the thread locker, and Lije's wrench slipped twice before finding purchase. His hands were numb with cold, and sweat had frozen on his forehead despite the sub-zero temperature. The bear lay motionless beside him, conserving energy, but he could feel its attention like a physical presence. When the bolt finally broke free, The trap's mechanism shifted with an audible click. One of the spring assemblies had been neutralized, reducing the pressure on the steel jaws by perhaps 20%. It wasn't enough to free the bear's leg, but it was progress. The great animal lifted its head slightly, sensing the change. "That's one down," Lee said, flexing his stiff fingers. "3 more to go." He'd been working for over an hour, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. Snow had drifted against the fallen log, creating a natural windbreak that made their position feel almost cozy despite the circumstances. The bear's body heat was melting the snow immediately around it, creating a small pocket of bare ground that steamed in the cold air. Lije moved to the second spring assembly, noting how the trap's designer had staggered the access points to make tampering difficult. Each bolt was positioned so that removing it required a different tool angle, preventing someone from developing an efficient rhythm. Whoever had built this device understood that captured animals often had friends or family members who might attempt to rescue. As he worked, Lije found himself talking to the bear. It was something he'd never done with wild animals before, but the creature's obvious intelligence seemed to invite conversation. He told it about his cabin, about the winters when snow piled so deep against the walls that he had to dig tunnels to reach his woodshed. He described the spring thaws when the creek behind his place ran wild with snowmelt, and the brief summers when wildflowers painted the meadows in colors that had no names. The bear listened with what appeared to be genuine interest, occasionally making soft chuffing sounds that might have been responses. His dark eyes never left Lije's face, and he began to understand that this was more than simple animal curiosity. The creature was studying him, learning his patterns and intentions the way a human might assess a new acquaintance. The second spring assembly proved easier than the first. The bolts came free with steady pressure, and when the mechanism disengaged, the trap's jaws visibly loosened. The bear immediately tested its trapped leg, pulling against the steel with renewed hope. Blood flowed more freely from the wounds, which was actually a good sign. It meant circulation was returning to the damaged limb. "Easy there," Lije cautioned. "Don't tear anything loose yet. We've got more work to do." The bear seemed to understand, settling back with what looked remarkably like patience. But Lije could see the effort it was costing the animal to remain still. Every instinct was probably screaming at it to fight, to struggle, to use its massive strength against the trap that held it. That it was resisting those impulses spoke to an intelligence that made him more determined than ever to succeed. The third assembly was positioned on the opposite side of the trap, requiring Lije to crawl around the bear's massive body. The animal watched his movements with alert eyes, but made no aggressive gestures. When he accidentally brushed against its shoulder, the bear didn't flinch or growl. It simply adjusted its position slightly to give him better access to the mechanism. Close, Lije could see details that amazed him. The bear's fur wasn't uniformly brown as it appeared from a distance, but was actually composed of individual hairs in dozens of different shades: chocolate and amber, silver and black, creating a complex pattern that seemed to shift in the changing light. Each hair was hollow at the core, designed to trap air for insulation. The evolutionary engineering was more sophisticated than anything humans had created. The bear's paws were equally impressive, massive structures that combined delicate dexterity with crushing power. The claws were 4 inches long and curved, like scimitars, capable of ripping apart logs or delicately extracting grubs from rotting wood. Lije had seen what those claws could do to a man, but right now they lay curled and harmless against the snow. "You're quite a piece of work," he murmured, working on the stubborn bolts. "Mother Nature doesn't make anything finer than a grizzly bear. Whoever set this trap has no idea what they're messing with." The third spring assembly finally yielded, and the trap's pressure decreased noticeably. The bear's leg was still held fast, but now it could move its foot slightly within the steel jaws. Hope flickered in those intelligent eyes, and the animal made a sound that was almost conversational. "I know," Lije replied. "Almost there. One more assembly, and you'll be able to pull free." But as he moved toward the final mechanism, something made him pause. A sound that didn't belong, the distant growl of an engine echoing through the storm. Vehicle noise, coming from the direction of the old logging road. The poachers were returning. Earlier than expected, the bear heard it too. Its head came up sharply, ears pricked forward, and a low rumble emerged from deep in its chest. But the sound wasn't directed at Lije. The animal was looking toward the approaching engine noise with what appeared to be recognition. It knew these sounds, had heard them before. This wasn't the first time the poachers had visited their trap. Lije's mind raced through possibilities. The vehicle was still a good distance away, maybe half a mile, but it was definitely getting closer. On the logging road, even a four-wheel drive truck would have to move slowly through the snow. That gave him perhaps 10 minutes before the poachers reached the area where they'd left their trail into the timber. 10 minutes to free an animal that had taken him over an hour to partially release. It wasn't enough time, not if he wanted to do the job safely and thoroughly. But if he abandoned the effort now, the bear would die. The poachers would find their prize exactly as they'd left it, and whatever fate they had planned would proceed. Without interference, the bear was watching him intently, seeming to understand that critical decisions were being made. In those dark eyes, Lije saw something that reminded him of the men he'd served with in Vietnam. Soldiers who'd found themselves in impossible situations and had to trust their leader to find a way out. He'd never let his men down when it mattered. He wasn't about to start with a wounded bear. "Change of plans," he said, pulling the bolt cutters from his pack. "We're going to do this the fast way." The steel cables that formed the trap's main structure were thick and hardened, designed to resist exactly this kind of attack. But Lije's bolt cutters were heavy-duty tools, and desperation could multiply a man's strength beyond normal limits. He positioned the cutting jaws around the first cable and squeezed with everything he had. The cable parted with a sharp snap that seemed to echo through the forest. The trap's remaining mechanisms immediately shifted, springs rebalancing to compensate for the broken component. The bear's trapped leg moved more freely now, though it was still held by the remaining cables. The engine noise was getting closer. Lije could distinguish the particular sound of a diesel motor working hard in low gear, probably a pickup truck or SUV with four-wheel drive. The poachers had chosen their vehicle, well, something with enough ground clearance and traction to navigate mountain roads in winter conditions. He attacked the second cable with savage efficiency, his movements fueled by the same cold focus that had once made him effective in combat. The steel resisted. The metal had limits just like everything else. The second cable snapped, then the third. With each break, the trap's grip on the bear's leg weakened. The fourth cable was positioned awkwardly, requiring Lije to reach across the bear's body to get the right angle. The animal seemed to understand what he was trying to do and shifted its weight to help. When the final cable parted, the trap's jaws opened just enough for the bear to pull its damaged leg free. The great animal stood slowly, testing its weight on the injured limb. Blood flowed freely from the wounds where the steel had bitten deep, but the leg held. The bear took a tentative step, then another. It was mobile hurt, but not crippled. The engine noise was very close now, maybe 200 yards away. Through the falling snow, Lije could see the faint glow of headlights filtering through the trees. The poachers had reached the point where they'd left the logging road and started into the timber. The bear looked at him one last time, and Lije felt it too. Communication passed between them that had nothing to do with words. Gratitude, yes, but also something deeper, a recognition of shared understanding, of two creatures who'd helped each other escape traps that others had set for them. Then the great animal turned, and melted into the forest with surprising grace. For something so large and injured, within seconds, it had vanished completely, leaving only tracks in the snow that were already being filled by fresh snowfall. Lije gathered his tools quickly, shoving everything into his pack without regard for organization. The poachers would be here soon, and he needed to be gone when they arrived. But as he prepared to leave, one more task occurred to him. He pulled his knife and went to work on the trap's remaining mechanisms, cutting springs and destroying components with methodical precision. When he was finished, the device would never hold another animal. It was nothing but expensive scrap metal now, a testament to the futility of trying to cage something that was meant to be free. Asterisk. Lije had covered maybe 50 yards when he heard the voices. 2 men, maybe 3. Their words carried on the wind but too distant to make out clearly. They'd found the trap, or what was left of it. The tone of their conversation told him everything he needed to know about their mood. Anger, confusion, and something that might have been fear. He moved through the timber with the careful stealth he'd learned 40 years ago in another forest on the other side of the world. Each step was placed deliberately, avoiding branches that might snap or rocks that might shift. His breathing was controlled, silent. The falling snow helped muffle any sounds he might make, but it also limited his visibility and made the footing treacherous. The voices grew louder as more men arrived at the clearing. Lije counted at least 4 distinct speakers now, which meant this wasn't a casual poaching operation. Professional wildlife smugglers often worked in teams, with different specialists handling capture, transport, and sales. The investment in sophisticated equipment like the trap suggested they had serious money behind them. He found a position behind a cluster of granite boulders about 100 yards from the clearing, close enough to observe, but far enough away to avoid detection. The rocks provided good cover and multiple escape routes if the situation went bad. From here, he could see the glow of flashlights moving through the trees and hear fragments of conversation. Completely destroyed. Someone cut the cables. Tracks everywhere. Looks like they had tools. Theirs gone. Trail leads off into the timber, but it's filling with snow. Lije smiled grimly. The poachers had found exactly what he'd intended them to find: evidence of their failure, and no clear indication of who was responsible. The storm was erasing the bear's escape route and most of the human tracks around the trap site. By morning, there would be little left to investigate. A new voice joined the conversation, deeper and more authoritative than the others. How long since the trap was sprung? Hard to say. Blood's mostly frozen, but there's still some fresh flow. Maybe 4, 5 hours? And how long to cut through those cables? With the right tools? Maybe an hour. Could be less if they knew what they were doing. The authoritative voice was quiet for a moment. Someone's been watching us. This wasn't random. They knew exactly how to disable the mechanism. Professional job. Lije felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. These men weren't going to write off their loss and move on to easier targets. They were taking it personally, and that made them dangerous in ways that went beyond simple poaching. Through the falling snow, he could see the flashlight beams converging on the trap site. The men were examining his handiwork, trying to understand what had happened and who might be responsible. One of them was kneeling beside the destroyed mechanism, running his hands over the cut cables with what appeared to be professional interest. This was done by someone who understands mechanical systems, the voice reported. Clean cuts, minimal damage to surrounding components. They disabled exactly what needed to be disabled and nothing more. Military? Another voice asked. Could be, or someone with engineering background. Either way, they knew what they were doing. Lije absorbed this assessment with mixed feelings. His military training was showing, which could be either good or bad, depending on how these men chose to respond. Professional criminals often had their own military connections. and they might recognize the tactical implications of what he'd done. The deeper voice spoke again. "Fan out and look for tracks. Someone was here recently. The tool marks on those cables are fresh. They might still be in the area." That was Lije's cue to leave. He'd learned what he needed to know about the opposition, and staying longer would only increase the risk of detection. These men were organized, experienced, and now they were actively hunting for whoever had interfered with their operation. He began moving away from the boulder cluster, using a route that would take him deeper into the timber before circling back toward his cabin. The snow was falling harder now, which would help cover his retreat, but also make navigation more difficult. In weather like this, it was easy to become disoriented, to walk in circles until hypothermia or exhaustion brought you down. But Lije knew these mountains better than anyone. He'd spent 15 years learning every trail and landmark, memorizing the terrain until he could navigate it in complete darkness. The storm might slow him down, but it wouldn't stop him dead. As he moved through the forest, his mind was already working on the larger problem. The poachers weren't going to give up after losing one bear. If anything, the interference would make them more determined, more careful. They'd probably increase security, maybe postguards at their trap sites, and they'd be looking for whoever had cost them a valuable animal and expensive equipment. The smart thing would be to stay clear of them, to mind his own business, and let the authorities handle it when they eventually discovered the illegal operation. But Lije had seen enough of the wildlife trade to know how it worked. By the time game wardens got involved, these men would be long gone, leaving behind empty traps and depleted animal populations. And there was something else, something more personal that he couldn't ignore. The bear had trusted him. In those dark, intelligent eyes, he'd seen a recognition that went beyond simple gratitude. The great animal had understood that they were alike, somehow both trapped by circumstances beyond their control, both struggling to break free from steel that others had forged. He'd spent 15 years in these mountains trying to escape his own traps, the invisible snares of memory and guilt that had held him as surely as steel cables. The bear's liberation had felt like his own, a symbolic breaking of chains that had bound him since the war. Walking away now would feel like a betrayal of something important, something that might be his only chance at real redemption. The voices behind him were fading, but he could still see the glow of flashlights through the trees. The poachers were conducting a systematic search of the area, looking for any clue that might lead them to their mysterious saboteur. They were being thorough, professional. These weren't amateurs who would give up easily. Lije reached a familiar ridge and paused to get his bearings. His cabin was about 2 miles southeast, hidden in a fold of the mountains where casual visitors would never find it. The old logging road that the poachers had used was roughly parallel to his route home, which meant there was some chance of encountering their vehicle on the way out. That thought sparked an idea. If he could get a look at their truck, maybe get a license plate number, he could pass the information along to the authorities. It wouldn't be enough to stop the operation immediately, but it might start an investigation that would eventually shut them down. The wind was picking up again, driving snow through the trees with increasing force. Visibility was dropping too. Almost nothing, and the temperature was falling fast. These were the conditions that killed people in the mountains, when overconfidence met bad weather and simple mistakes became fatal errors. But Lije had survived worse. He'd walked point through monsoon forests where you couldn't see 10 feet in any direction, had navigated mountain passes in Afghanistan where one wrong step meant a 1,000-foot fall. This was just Montana weather. Dangerous, but predictable. If you understood its patterns, he altered his route slightly, angling toward the logging road. If the poacher's vehicle was still there, he might be able to gather useful intelligence. If they'd already left, he could at least confirm their departure and plan his next moves accordingly. The forest around him was alive with the sounds of the storm wind sighing through pine boughs, snow hissing against bark, the occasional crack of a branch breaking under accumulated weight. But underneath those natural sounds, Lije's trained ears detected something else. Footsteps moving through the snow with deliberate care. Someone was following his trail. He stopped behind a large pine and listened carefully. The footsteps weren't random. They were tracking him, staying roughly on his route, but moving more slowly. One person, probably male based on the stride length and the weight suggested by the sound. Someone who knew how to move quietly in the woods but wasn't quite as skilled as Lije himself. The hunter had become the hunted. But that was a game Lije had played before, and he'd gotten very good at it during his years in special forces. The question was whether he wanted to avoid his pursuer or confront him directly. Avoiding contact would be safer, but might not solve the larger problem. If one of the poachers had picked up his trail, others might be doing the same thing. They could be setting up a net to contain him, using their superior numbers to limit his options. Confronting the tracker was riskier, but might give him valuable intelligence about their operation and intentions. It would also send a message that their mysterious saboteur was more dangerous than they'd assumed. Lije made his decision. He'd spent too many years running from confrontations, hiding in the mountains from problems that couldn't be solved by isolation. The bear had shown him that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds were against you. It was time to stop being prey and start being the hunter again. Asterisk. Lije moved off his original trail and began a wide circle through the timber, using terrain features to mask his movement. The technique was called a counter-ambush maneuver, something he'd learned in advanced infantry training and perfected during night operations in Southeast Asia. The idea was to become the pursuer, instead of the pursued, to turn the tactical situation inside out. The snow helped and hindered in equal measure. It muffled his footsteps, but also made it harder to move silently through underbrush and deadfall. Every step had to be calculated, tested before committing his full weight. One snapped branch or shifted rock could alert his tracker and ruin the advantage he was trying to gain. He completed his circle in 20 minutes, moving through terrain that would have challenged an experienced woodsman in good weather. But Lije knew every depression and ridge in this section of forest, could navigate it by feel when necessary. The years of solitary wandering had given him an almost supernatural awareness of the landscape. His tracker was still following the original trail, moving slowly but persistently through the falling snow. Lije could see him now, a tall man in expensive winter gear, carrying what looked like a high-end rifle with a scope. Professional equipment, professionally used. This wasn't some local hired muscle, but someone with serious outdoor skills. Man was good, Lije had to admit. He stayed on the trail, even when snow had obscured most of the sign, reading subtle indicators that less experienced trackers would have missed. A broken twig here, a scuff mark on bark there, the faint depression where a boot had pressed into frozen ground. The tracker knew his business, but Lije was better. He'd been hunting men before this tracker was born, had learned his skills in places where second place meant death, and he had the home field advantage intimate knowledge of terrain that his pursuer was seeing for the first time. Lije positioned himself behind a massive deadfall where he could watch the trail while remaining completely hidden. The fallen tree was easily 6 feet in diameter, probably brought down by a windstorm years ago. Its exposed root system created a natural blind that was invisible from the tracker's position. The man approached carefully, rifle ready, but not aimed directly ahead. He was being cautious but not paranoid, confident in his abilities, but aware that his quarry might be dangerous. When he reached the spot where Lije had left his original trail, he stopped and knelt to examine the ground more closely. "I know. You're out there," the tracker called softly, his voice carrying just far enough to be heard over the wind. "Why don't we talk this through like civilized people?" Lije remained silent, studying the man's equipment and bearing. The rifle was a custom bolt-action in a heavy caliber, probably .338 Winchester Magnum or something similar. Expensive glass on top, the kind of scope that cost more than most people's cars. The winter clothing was high-end mountaineering gear, designed for extended operations in extreme conditions. This wasn't a poacher in the traditional sense. This was a professional hunter, someone who made his living tracking dangerous game. The kind of man who got hired when wealthy clients wanted guaranteed success on African safaris or Alaskan bear hunts. "My name's Carson," the tracker continued, still scanning the forest around him. "I work for people who invest serious money in wildlife operations. Someone cost them a valuable asset today, and they'd like to discuss compensation." The words were polite, almost conversational, but the underlying threat was clear. Lije had interfered with a business operation, and the people behind it wanted restitution. In their world, such matters were probably settled with money or violence, depending on the debtor's ability to pay. Carson moved forward again, following Lije's trail with methodical precision. But he was working from old sign now, tracks that were being steadily erased by fresh snowfall. Soon he would reach the point where Lije had left the trail, and then he would have to make choices about which direction his quarry had gone. Lije let him get 20 yards past the deadfall before making his move. He came up behind Carson with the silent grace of a hunting cat, using the storm's noise to mask his approach. When he was close enough to smell the other man's aftershave, he spoke. "Drop the rifle." Carson froze but didn't comply immediately. "You're making a mistake, friend. These people don't forgive and forget." "The rifle," Lije repeated, letting his voice carry the kind of authority that came from years of giving orders that had to be obeyed. On the ground now, Carson lowered the weapon slowly, placing it in the snow at his feet. He was being smart, no sudden movements, no attempt to spin and fire. He'd recognized the professional competence in Lije's voice and was responding accordingly. "Turn around," Lije instructed. "Hands where I can see them." When Carson turned, Lije saw a face that matched the voice, weathered but not old, eyes that had seen violence but weren't afraid of it. This was a man who'd been in dangerous situations before and survived through skill and judgment rather than luck. "You're military?" Carson said, making it a statement rather than a question. "Special forces, I guess. Probably Vietnam era, based on your age." "Close enough," Lije replied, keeping his own rifle trained on Carson's center mass. "Who do you work for? Does it matter?" "They're not the forgiving type, whoever they are. You cost them maybe $50,000 today, plus the price of custom equipment. They're going to want satisfaction. From an old man who lives alone in the mountains?" Carson smiled, and there was genuine amusement in his expression. "Old man, maybe, but not helpless. You took apart their trap like you knew exactly what you were doing. Then you disappeared into the forest without leaving enough trail for most people to follow. That's not the work of some random do-gooder." Lije absorbed this assessment while considering his options. Carson was right about one thing. The people behind the poaching operation wouldn't simply write off their losses. They'd invested too much money and effort to walk away after one setback. And they demonstrated the resources to hire professionals like Carson, which meant they had serious backing. "What were they planning to do with the bear?" Lije asked. "Private reserve in Texas. Client wants to hunt a grizzly, but doesn't want to deal with permits and regulations. Easier to stock a fenced preserve with tame animals that have been conditioned to human presence." The casual way Carson described the operation made Lije's stomach turn. Capturing wild bears for canned hunts was among the most despicable forms of wildlife trafficking. The animals would be transported to Texas, kept in minimal enclosures until they were docile from captivity, then released into fenced hunting. Preserves where wealthy clients could shoot them at close range with no risk or skill required. How many animals have you taken? Lije asked. From this area? Maybe a dozen over the past 2 years. Bears mostly, but some wolves and mountain lions. There's good money in providing exotic hunting experiences for people who can afford them. Dozen animals. Lije thought about the bear he'd freed, about the intelligence and dignity in those dark eyes. The idea that 11 others had already been condemned to lives of captivity and meaningless death made something cold and hard settle in his chest. What's your real name? He asked Carson. Does it matter? It might. Depends on whether you walk out of these mountains or get carried out. Carson's expression grew more serious. That kind of talk is going to escalate this situation beyond where either of us wants it to go. I'm just doing a job. You cost my employers some money. They want to recoup their losses and prevent future interference. There's room for negotiation. If you're willing to be reasonable. What kind of negotiation? Information about your operation, who you're working with, what your capabilities are, how much you know about their business. In exchange, they might be willing to move their activities to a different area. Lije almost laughed. Carson was assuming he represented some kind of organized opposition, possibly law enforcement or environmental activists. The tracker couldn't conceive that one old man acting alone might have disrupted their carefully planned operation. I don't have an operation, Lije said. I live alone up here. I found your trap by accident and didn't like what I saw. Carson's eyes narrowed. One man? You're telling me one man took apart a custom restraint system and disappeared into the wilderness? Without backup? That's exactly what I'm telling you. For the first time, Carson looked genuinely concerned. Professional criminals could deal with law enforcement or organized opposition because those threats followed predictable patterns. But a lone individual acting on personal conviction was unpredictable, potentially much more dangerous than an entire agency bound by regulations and procedures. If that's true, Carson said slowly, then you've just made yourself the most wanted man in 3 states. These people don't tolerate interference, and they have resources you can't imagine. They'll bring in more people like me, professionals, who specialize in finding people who don't want to be found. Let them come, Lije replied. I've been found before. Carson studied his face for a long moment, reading something there that made him nod slowly. Vietnam wasn't your last war, was it? No, Lije admitted. But it might have been my most honest one. The wind was picking up again, driving snow through the trees with renewed force. Visibility was dropping rapidly, and the temperature was falling toward levels that could kill an unprepared person in hours. This conversation needed to end soon, one way or another. What happens now? Carson asked. Lije considered the question carefully. Killing Carson would solve one problem, but create several others. The tracker's employers would know something had gone wrong when he failed to report back. They send more people, probably with instructions to shoot first and ask questions later. But letting him go carried its own risks. Carson had demonstrated considerable skill as a tracker and hunter. If he returned with detailed information about Lije's capabilities and location, the next encounter might not be so one-sided. You're going to walk back to your vehicle and leave, Lije said finally. You're going to tell your employers that their trap was destroyed by someone with military training who knows these mountains better than they do. And you're going to recommend that they find somewhere else to conduct their business. And if they don't take that advice, then they'll discover that some old soldiers never really stop fighting. They just choose their battles more carefully. Carson nodded slowly, understanding passing between 2 professionals who'd faced violence before. Fair enough, but this won't end here. They've got too much invested to walk away. I know, Lije replied. I'm counting on it. Lije watched Carson disappear into the storm, then waited another 20 minutes before moving. The snow was falling, so heavily now that the tracker's footprints were already being erased. But Lije took a circuitous route back toward his cabin anyway. Professional paranoia died hard, and Carson had struck him as someone who might double back to gather more intelligence. The temperature was dropping fast, and the wind was building toward what the old-timers called a ground blizzard, the kind of storm that could bury a man alive if he got caught in the open. Lije picked up his pace, using landmarks he could identify even in near-zero visibility to navigate toward home. He was thinking about Carson's words as he walked. 12 animals taken over 2 years. That suggested a sophisticated operation with significant financial backing and careful planning. These weren't opportunistic poachers grabbing whatever they could find, but professionals targeting specific species for specific markets. The thought of the bear he'd freed ending up in some Texas hunting preserve made his jaw clench. He'd seen enough of war to understand that courage and dignity could be found in the strangest places. But it took a special kind of cruelty to reduce magnificent, wild creatures to carnival attractions for rich men who wanted to play at being hunters. His cabin appeared through the swirling snow like a mirage, its familiar outline bringing relief he hadn't realized he needed. The structure looked small and vulnerable against the storm, but its log walls were thick enough to turn aside anything short of a rifle bullet. More importantly, it was home, the first place that had felt like home since he'd returned from the war. Lije stopped at his workshop before going inside, hanging his wet gear on pegs and checking his equipment. The bolt cutters had served their purpose, but the trap they'd destroyed was probably just one of several the poachers had deployed. If Carson was right about the scope of their operation, there might be other animals caught in similar devices right now, slowly dying while their captors waited for the storm to pass. Inside the cabin, he built up the fire and put coffee on to brew. The familiar rituals of mountain living, splitting kindling, adjusting dampers, measuring grounds, helped calm his mind and focus his thoughts. But underneath the surface calm, something was building. A sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. A clarity that came from finally finding a cause worth fighting for. He was halfway through his first cup of coffee when he heard the sound that changed everything. A scratching at his door. Soft, hesitant, but unmistakably deliberate. Not the random noise of wind-blown debris, but something alive, trying to get his attention. Lije set down his cup and reached for his rifle, moving to the window beside the door. The storm made it impossible to see clearly, but there was definitely something large on his porch. Something that filled the space between the door and the railing, dark against the white snow. The scratching came again, more insistent this time, and underneath it, a sound that made his heart skip a low, rumbling vocalization that he recognized immediately. The bear had found him. Lije opened the door slowly, keeping the rifle ready but not aimed. The great animal was lying on its side. On his porch, its injured legs stretched out at an awkward angle. Blood had frozen on the fur around the trap wounds, and the bear's breathing was labored. But those intelligent dark eyes were alert, fixed on Lije's face with an expression that looked remarkably like hope. "Well, I'll be damned," Lije murmured. "How did you find me?" The bear made a soft chuffing sound, almost conversational. It had clearly followed his scent trail through the storm, covering rough terrain on 3 good legs and 1 damaged one. The effort must have been enormous, but here it was, seeking help from the human who had freed it from the trap. Lije knelt beside the massive head, noting how the bear didn't flinch when he approached. If anything, it seemed to relax slightly, as if his presence brought comfort. He examined the injured leg more closely, seeing that the wounds were worse than he'd thought. The trap's steel jaws had crushed bone and torn muscle, and infection was already setting in despite the cold. "You're in bad shape, old fellow," Lije said quietly. "Those wounds need proper attention, and you need somewhere warm to heal." The bear's eyes never left his face, and Lije felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. This magnificent creature had trusted him once, had followed him through a blizzard seeking help. Walking away now would be a betrayal of something profound, not just an animal's trust, but his own chance at redemption. But treating a wounded grizzly bear presented challenges that went far beyond normal veterinary care. The animal weighed 700 pounds and possessed claws and teeth that could kill a man instantly. Even injured and exhausted, it was potentially lethal. And harboring it would put Lije in direct conflict with wildlife regulations, not to mention common sense. None of that seemed to matter. The bear had made its choice, and now Lije had to make his. "All right," he said, standing slowly. "But we're going to have to trust each other completely. One wrong move from either of us, and this ends badly for both of us." The bear seemed to understand. When Lije opened his cabin door wider, the great animal struggled to its feet and limped inside. It moved carefully, avoiding Lije's furniture and belongings, settling finally near the fireplace where the warmth could reach its injured leg. Lije closed the door behind them and stood for a moment, processing what he'd just done. He was sharing his cabin with a wild grizzly bear, not just any bear, but one that was wounded, possibly desperate, and certainly capable of destroying everything he built in a matter of minutes. But as he watched the bear settle beside his fireplace, he felt something shift inside his chest. For 15 years, he'd lived alone in these mountains, cutting himself off from human connection because the weight of his war experiences had made relationships too painful to maintain. He convinced himself that solitude was healing, that isolation was the price of peace. Now, looking at this magnificent creature that had sought him out in its time of need, he realized how wrong he'd been. Healing didn't come from running away from connection. It came from finding the right kind of connection, with beings who understood suffering and survival and the long road back from both. The bear's presence changed the cabin's entire atmosphere. What had been a refuge from the world became something warmer, a sanctuary where two damaged souls could find shelter together. The fire seemed brighter, the walls more welcoming. Even the storm outside sounded less threatening with the great animal's steady breathing filling the silence. Lije went to his medical supplies and began gathering what he'd need to treat the bear's wounds. Antiseptic, bandages, antibiotics from his own emergency kit. It wasn't proper veterinary equipment, but it would have to do. The bear watched his preparations with calm attention, as if it understood exactly what was happening. "We're going to get you fixed up," Lije said, more to himself than to the bear. "And then we're going to figure out how to stop those bastards from taking any more animals." The bear made a soft rumbling sound that might have been agreement. Or maybe it was just contentment at being warm and safe for the first time in days. Either way, it was a sound that spoke of trust and partnership. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the cabin, something new was beginning. An alliance between species, forged in shared suffering and mutual respect. A partnership that would change both their lives in ways neither could imagine. As Lije knelt beside the bear and began cleaning its wounds, he realized that Carson had been wrong about one thing. This wasn't just about one old man fighting a criminal organization. It was about something much more powerful, a bond between two creatures who had found each other when they needed it most, and who were prepared to face whatever came next. Together, the poachers had created an enemy more dangerous than they could possibly understand. Not just a skilled soldier with knowledge of the terrain, but a man who had found something worth protecting again. Someone who had remembered that courage wasn't about facing death alone, but about standing beside those who trusted you, no matter what the odds. The bear's dark eyes reflected the firelight as Lije worked on its wounds, and in those depths, he saw something he hadn't seen in his own mirror for decades. Hope. Real hope, based not on forgetting the past, but on building something better from its lessons. Tomorrow, the storm would pass, and Carson's employers would begin planning their response to the interference with their operation. They would bring more men, better equipment, and a determination to eliminate whatever was standing in their way. They would find Lije waiting for them. But they wouldn't find him alone. The great bear shifted slightly, moving its massive paw until it rested gently against Lije's knee. The gesture was unmistakably deliberate, a sign of trust and companionship that transcended the boundaries between species. Lije placed his hand on the thick fur of the bear's shoulder, feeling the steady heartbeat beneath. Two survivors, two fighters. Two souls who had found each other in the wilderness and discovered that some bonds were stronger than fear. "We'll show them," he said quietly. "We'll show them what happens when they mess with things they don't understand." The bear's rumbling response sounded remarkably like agreement. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, but inside the cabin, warmth and purpose were building towards something that would reshape the entire conflict. The hunters were about to become the hunted, and they had no idea what was coming for them. The storm passed during the night, leaving the world wrapped in 3 feet of fresh snow that sparkled like diamonds in the morning sun. Lije woke to find the bear still sleeping beside the fireplace, its massive form rising and falling with steady breaths. The animal's injured leg was properly bandaged now, and the antiseptic he'd applied seemed to be preventing infection from taking hold. He moved quietly around the cabin, rebuilding the fire and starting coffee, careful not to disturb his unlikely houseguest. The bear's presence had transformed his morning routine into something almost ceremonial. Shared space required different courtesies, a recognition that he was no longer the sole occupant of this sanctuary. When the coffee was ready, Lije settled into his chair with a steaming cup and considered what needed to be done. Carson would have reported back to his employers by now, describing the encounter and Lije's capabilities. The professionals behind the poaching operation would be planning their response, probably bringing in more personnel and heavier equipment. This isolated valley was about to become a battleground. The bear stirred as sunlight streamed through the windows, lifting its massive head to look around the cabin with what appeared to be mild curiosity. When its eyes met Lije's, the animal made a soft chuffing sound that might have been a greeting. "Morning to you too," Lije replied, surprised at how natural the conversation felt. "How's the leg feeling?" The bear tested its weight on the injured limb, moving carefully but without the obvious pain of the previous day. Lije's field medicine had been effective, though the animal would need weeks to heal completely. The question was whether they had weeks before Carson's people returned with reinforcements. After breakfast canned stew for himself, fresh salmon from his freezer for the bear, Lije began preparing for what was coming. His military training had taught him that successful defense required understanding your enemy's capabilities and intentions, then using terrain and preparation to multiply your own advantages. The cabin's location was both a strength and a weakness. It was isolated and easily defended, with clear fields of fire in all directions and multiple escape routes through the timber behind. But it was also a fixed position, and anyone who knew its location could plan an attack accordingly. Carson had seen the cabin's general area, which meant the poachers knew roughly where to find him. Lije spent the morning checking his weapons and equipment. His rifle was well maintained but old, a hunting weapon rather than a military arm. He had perhaps 200 rounds of ammunition, adequate for hunting, but not for an extended firefight. His pistol was a .45 automatic he'd carried since Vietnam. Reliable, but showing its age. More concerning was his lack of modern tactical equipment. No night vision, no communications gear, no body armor. He'd been living as a civilian for 15 years, and his preparations reflected that reality. Against professional criminals with military-grade equipment, his advantages would be limited to terrain, knowledge, and tactical experience. The bear watched his preparations with obvious interest, seeming to understand that something significant was being planned. When Lije laid out maps of the surrounding area on his kitchen table, The great animal actually approached to study the terrain markers, its intelligence once again surprising him. "See this ridgeline?" Lije said, pointing to a series of contour lines on the map. "That's the most likely approach route. Good concealment through the timber, but it follows them into this clearing here where we'd have overlapping fields of fire." The bear made a rumbling sound, and Lije could have sworn it was paying attention to his tactical analysis. The idea that he was briefing a grizzly bear on defensive positions should have seemed absurd, but nothing about this situation followed normal rules. By midday, Lije had developed a preliminary defense plan based on the assumption that Carson's employers would send a team of 4 to 6 professionals to eliminate him. They'd probably approach during daylight, using superior firepower and numbers to overwhelm his position quickly. The key would be disrupting their plan before they could execute it effectively. He spent the afternoon preparing defensive positions around the cabin, cleared firing lanes through the timber, concealed observation posts, improvised obstacles that would channel attackers into predetermined kill zones. The work was exhausting for a man his age, but muscle memory from decades-old training made the task feel familiar. The bear helped in ways that surprised him. When Lije was moving fallen logs to create barriers, the animal would position itself to help leverage heavy timber into place. When he was clearing brush from shooting positions, the bear seemed to understand which vegetation needed to be removed and which provided useful concealment. It was an unlikely partnership, but it worked. By late afternoon, they had transformed the area around the cabin into a defensive position that would challenge even professional assault teams. More importantly, they had developed a working relationship based on mutual trust and shared purpose. As the sun began to set, Lije noticed the bear becoming restless. The great animal paced around the cabin, sniffing the air and making soft vocalizations that suggested heightened alertness. When it moved to the window facing the logging road, Lije joined it there. At first, he saw nothing unusual. The forest was beautiful in the golden evening light, snow-covered pines stretching away toward distant peaks. But as he watched, movement caught his eye, a glint of metal reflecting sunlight, maybe 2 miles away on the ridgeline where the old logging road crested the divide. Vehicle. Probably multiple vehicles, moving slowly through the snow. Carson's people had returned, and they brought reinforcements. Lije went to his rifle and chambered a round, then checked his pistol and spare magazines. The bear watched these preparations with calm attention, showing no fear despite the obvious tension in the air. If anything, the animal seemed to be preparing itself as well, testing its injured leg and positioning itself near the door. "You don't have to be part of this," Lije said quietly. "This is human business. You could disappear into the forest and be safe." The bear looked at him with those intelligent dark eyes, and Lije saw his answer there. The great animal had made its choice when it sought shelter in his cabin. They were partners now, for better or worse. Through binoculars, Lije counted 3 vehicles moving along the ridge, probably SUVs or pickup trucks with 4-wheel drive. Even at this distance, he could see they were heavily loaded, carrying more personnel and equipment than a simple cleanup operation would require. Carson's employers were taking this seriously. The vehicle stopped at a point where the logging road offered a clear view of the valley below. Lije could imagine the tactical planning taking place, identifying the cabin's location, planning approach routes, assigning responsibilities to team members. Professional killers preparing for what they assumed would be a straightforward elimination job. They would be in for several surprises. As darkness fell, Lee saw lights moving through the timber, flashlights and probably night vision equipment. The assault team was moving into position, using the cover of night to get close to their target. Their plan was predictable. Surround the cabin, eliminate the occupant, and search for evidence of larger opposition. Lije extinguished all lights in the cabin and moved to his primary observation post, a concealed position in the rocks behind his home. The bear followed silently, moving with surprising stealth for something so large. From their position, they could see the entire clearing around the cabin while remaining invisible to attackers. The first sign of movement came at 10 o'clock, a shadow detaching itself from the tree line and moving toward the cabin's east wall. Then another figure approaching from the south. Professional spacing, coordinated movement, sound, tactical discipline. These men knew their business, that they were operating in Lije's backyard, on terrain he knew better than his own hands. And they had no idea that their target was watching them from a position they hadn't even considered. The bear seemed to sense the approaching danger. Its breathing became deeper, more controlled, and Lije could feel tension building in the grate. Body beside him, whatever was about to happen, they would face it together. 4 figures had emerged from the timber now, moving in a classic diamond formation toward the cabin. Professional military tactics, executed with precision and confidence. But as they closed on their target, they were walking into a trap that had been prepared by someone who understood their methods better than they understood his. Lije settled his rifle's crosshairs on the lead figure and took up slack in the trigger. Beside him, the bear gathered itself like a coiled spring, ready to explode into action when the moment came. The final confrontation was about to begin, and neither the bear nor the man intended to go quietly into whatever darkness these intruders had planned for them. In the distance, an owl called through the night, a sound that belonged to this wild place, a reminder that some things were worth fighting to preserve. Lije smiled grimly and adjusted his grip on the rifle. It was time to show these professionals what happened when they threatened the wrong old soldier and his unlikely ally. The battle for the mountain was about to begin. The first shot shattered the night's silence like thunder rolling through the mountains. Lije's bullet found its target, dropping the lead assault team member before the man could reach the cabin's front porch. The figure crumpled without a sound, his high-tech equipment suddenly useless against precision marksmanship from an unexpected position. Contact front. Someone shouted from the timber, using military terminology that confirmed Lije's assessment of their training. Sniper in the rocks behind the cabin. The remaining 3 attackers immediately went to ground, disappearing behind trees and deadfall with the practiced speed of combat veterans. Muzzle flashes began strobing from their positions as they returned fire, bullets whining off granite and splintering pine bark around Lije's concealed position. But they were shooting at shadows, trying to hit a target they couldn't see while he had clear sight lines to their muzzle flashes. Lije's second shot took down another figure who'd exposed himself while changing positions. The man's tactical vest no match for a hunting rifle at close range. The bear remained motionless beside him, watching the battle with calm intelligence. When one of the attackers tried to flank their position by circling through the timber to the north, the great animal's ears tracked the movement before Lije could hear it. A soft growl warned him of the approaching threat. Lije shifted his aim toward the flanking movement just as the third attacker emerged from behind a massive pine, assault rifle raised and ready. But the man's night vision equipment worked against him in this situation. The electronic enhancement created a narrow field of view that missed the bear's position entirely. The grizzly moved with devastating speed despite its injured leg. 700 pounds of muscle and bone launched itself through 20 feet of space in less than 2 seconds. Massive jaws closing around the attacker's torso before he could bring his weapon to bear. The man's scream cut off abruptly as those powerful jaws did what millions of years of evolution had designed them to do. The fourth attacker, the last one standing, began firing wildly in the direction of his fallen teammate's position. But panic shooting was never effective, and his bullets went high and wide while Lije calmly lined up his final shot. The crack of the hunting rifle ended the firefight as suddenly as it had begun. Silence returned to the valley, broken only by the bear's heavy breathing and the distant sound of wind through the pines. 4 professional killers had approached Lije's cabin with military precision and superior firepower. None of them would be reporting back to their employers. "Well done, partner," Lee said quietly, reaching out to pat the bear's massive shoulder. The great animal was uninjured, though blood from its victim stained the fur around its muzzle. In combat, the grizzly had proved as formidable as any human warrior, but the night's work wasn't finished. These 4 had been the assault team, but professional operations always included backup elements and command personnel. Carson was probably coordinating from the vehicles on the ridge, and there might be other teams positioned to intercept anyone trying to escape the valley. Lije gathered ammunition and equipment from the fallen attackers, noting the quality of their gear: military-grade assault rifles, advanced night vision, encrypted communications equipment. These men had been equipped for a serious military operation, not a simple assassination. The organization behind them had significant resources and connections. One of the radios crackled with an incoming transmission. "Alpha Team, report status. Over." Lige keyed the microphone. "Alpha Team is down. Repeat, Alpha Team is down." A long pause, then Carson's voice came through the speaker. "Who is this?" "Someone who's tired of cleaning up your messes," Lije replied. "Your boys weren't as good as you thought they were. You have no idea what you're dealing with." Carson's voice carried a new edge of respect mixed with anger. "This organization spans 3 countries and moves millions of dollars annually. You've just declared war on people who make wars disappear." "Good," Lee said. "I was getting bored." He switched off the radio and smashed it against a rock, ensuring no one could use its signal to track their position. The bear watched this action with apparent approval, then moved to sniff at the other equipment scattered around the clearing. From their position in the rocks, Lije could see lights moving on the distant ridge. The remaining members of Carson's force were repositioning, probably planning their next move. But they would be more cautious now, having learned that their target was neither helpless nor alone. The bear's acute hearing detected something. Lije missed the sound of helicopters approaching from the south. The distinctive whoop-whoop of rotors echoed off the mountain peaks, growing steadily louder. Carson's people were bringing in air support, escalating the conflict beyond anything Lije had anticipated. "Time to go," he said, gathering his rifle and remaining ammunition. The cabin had served its purpose as a defensive position, but staying there now would be suicide. Against helicopter-mounted weapons, their rock shelter would provide no protection. The bear seemed to understand the change in tactical situation. When Lije moved toward the tree line behind their position, the great animal followed without hesitation. Despite its injured leg, it moved through the timber with surprising silence and speed. They were 50 yards into the forest when the first helicopter appeared over the ridge, its searchlight probing the darkness around the cabin. A second aircraft followed, then a third. Military surplus helicopters, probably armed with door-mounted machine guns and possibly rocket pods, the kind of firepower normally reserved for foreign battlefields. The lead helicopter's searchlight found the clearing where the assault team had fallen. Even from their distance in the timber, Lije could hear the pilot's report over external speakers. 4 Kia targets have withdrawn into the forest. Track them. Carson's amplified voice responded. Use thermal imaging. They can't. Have gone far. Asterisk. But Lije knew these mountains better than any thermal camera could penetrate them. There were caves and overhangs that would mask body heat, creek beds that would confuse scent trails, and terrain features that would challenge even experienced pilots. The bear seemed to know these hiding places as well, leading them toward a granite overhang that would provide concealment from aerial observation. As they reached the shelter, the helicopters began a systematic search pattern. their thermal sensors probing the forest for any sign of human or animal heat signatures. But the overhang was deep enough and the granite thick enough to shield them from electronic detection. Lije settled against the rock wall and began planning their next moves. Carson's organization had revealed capabilities that went far beyond simple poaching military helicopters, professional assault teams, encrypted communications. This was either a very sophisticated criminal enterprise or something with government connections, possibly both. The bear positioned itself at the mouth of their cave, watching the helicopter's search pattern with obvious intelligence. When one aircraft passed directly overhead, the animal remained perfectly still, understanding instinctively that movement would reveal their location. "You're a natural at this," Lije murmured, genuinely impressed by the bear's tactical awareness. "Ever think about a career in the military?" The bear made a soft chuffing sound that might have been amusement then, returned its attention to the helicopters circling above the valley. The great animal's calm acceptance of their dangerous situation gave Lije confidence that they would survive whatever came next. But survival was only the first step. Carson's people had escalated this conflict beyond simple retaliation for interfering with their operation. They brought military-grade weapons and personnel to eliminate one old man and a wounded bear, which suggested they saw this as a serious threat to their larger enterprise. That assessment was about to prove more accurate than they realized. Lije had spent 15 years in these mountains, learning every trail and hiding place, every natural feature that could be used for cover or concealment. And now he had a partner who understood the terrain as well as he did, who could move through the forest like a force of nature. The hunters had become the hunted, but the game was far from over. Carson's people had superior numbers and equipment, but they were operating in hostile territory against opponents who belonged here. The mountain itself was about to become an ally in ways they couldn't possibly anticipate. As the helicopters continued their futile search, Lije began planning a counterattack that would teach these professionals the difference between hunting animals and fighting a war. They wanted to escalate the conflict. He was prepared to show them exactly what escalation looked like when directed by someone who'd learned warfare in places where mistakes meant death. The bear seemed to sense his change in mood, turning from its watch position to meet his eyes. In that gaze, Lije saw the same cold determination that had once made him effective at killing enemy soldiers in the jungle. But this time, the cause was cleaner, the enemy more clearly defined. They were gone to finish this fight. And Carson's people were going to learn what happened when they threatened the wrong mountain and the creatures who called it home. Asterisk. The helicopters had been searching for over an hour when Lije decided to take the initiative. The aircraft were burning fuel at a prodigious rate, and their pilots were growing careless in their search patterns. Military surplus helicopters weren't designed for extended operations at high altitude, and the thin mountain air was pushing their engines toward their operational limits. More importantly, Lije had identified a weakness in their formation. The lead helicopter was maintaining position over the cabin area, while the other two conducted sweeps through the surrounding forest. But the lead aircraft's static position made it predictable, and predictability was always a tactical vulnerability. "Stay here," he whispered to the bear, gesturing toward the deeper recesses of their granite shelter. "This is going to get loud." The bear seemed to understand, settling back against the cave wall, but keeping its dark eyes fixed on Lije's face. Trust passed between them. The animal would wait for his return, no matter how long it took. Lije gathered the equipment he'd taken from the fallen assault team, focusing on items that could serve his immediate purpose. One of the attackers had carried military-grade explosive charges, probably intended for breaching the cabin's walls. The charges were small but powerful, designed for precision demolition work. He made his way through the forest using game trails and natural cover, moving with the patient stealth that had kept him alive during night operations in Vietnam. The Helicopter's noise covered any sounds he might make, and their searchlights actually helped by destroying the pilots. Night vision outside the illuminated areas. The lead helicopter was maintaining position, about 200 feet above the cabin. Its searchlight trained on the clearing where the assault team had fallen. The pilot was probably trying to determine what had happened to his ground forces, scanning for any sign of survivors or continuing threats. Lije reached a position directly below. The aircraft began climbing one of the massive pines that dominated this section of forest. The tree was old-growth timber, easily 6 feet in diameter and tall enough to reach within striking distance of the hovering helicopter. Its thick branches provided excellent concealment and multiple routes to the crown. The climb took 20 minutes, moving branch by branch with infinite care. One misstep would mean a 100-foot fall to the rocky ground below. But Lije's mountain-trained muscles and experienced hands found purchase on bark and branch with automatic precision. The explosive charges weighed him down, but not enough to compromise his balance dot at 150 feet above ground. He was close enough to the helicopter to feel its rotor wash pushing against the tree. The aircraft was maintaining a steady hover, its crew focused on the ground below rather than potential threats from above. Through the open cargo door, Lije could see 2 men with night vision equipment scanning the forest, searching for targets that were no longer there. He armed the first explosive charge and hurled it toward the helicopter's tail rotor. The device struck the rotor housing and detonated immediately, shredding the critical components that kept the aircraft stable in flight. The helicopter began spinning violently, its pilot fighting for control as the machine lost its ability to counter the main rotor's torque. The aircraft's death spiral took it away from Lije's tree and toward the open area above the cabin. Warning lights flashed frantically in the cockpit as alarms screamed through the night air. The pilot managed to auto-rotate the crippled machine toward a forced landing, but the helicopter struck the ground hard, its main rotor disintegrating on impact and sending deadly fragments spinning through the darkness. The remaining 2 helicopters immediately broke off their search patterns and converged on the crash site. But their rush to assist their downed comrades made them vulnerable to the same tactics that had destroyed the first aircraft. Lije was already moving to his next position, using the confusion and noise to mask his approach. The second helicopter had landed near the crash site, its crew dismounting to provide medical assistance. But landing made them sitting targets for someone who understood the vulnerability of grounded aircraft. He worked his way to within 50 yards of the landed helicopter before the bear found him. The great animal had ignored his instructions to stay hidden, following his trail through the forest with silent determination. When it appeared beside him in the darkness, Lije felt a moment of irritation followed by recognition. The bear understood something he'd missed. The third helicopter was circling overhead, using thermal imaging to scan the area around the crash site. The pilot had learned from his comrade's fate and was maintaining altitude and movement to prevent another attack from below. But thermal sensors worked both ways. They could detect heat signatures, but they also revealed the aircraft's position to anyone who understood their limitations. The bear moved past Lije toward the landed helicopter, and suddenly he understood the animal's plan. The grizzly was going to attack the ground crew directly, creating a distraction that would force the circling aircraft to descend and provide support. It was a brilliant tactical insight. Use the enemy's protective instincts against them. "Wait!" Lije called softly, but the bear was already in motion. 700 pounds of muscle and fury erupted from the tree line into the circle of light around the helicopter. The ground crew, 3 men with assault rifles, had perhaps 2 seconds to react before the grizzly was among them. Their weapons were designed for human opponents, not for something that could absorb multiple rifle rounds and keep attacking with undiminished ferocity. The bear's assault was devastating and brief. Within 30 seconds, the helicopter's ground crew was eliminated, and the aircraft itself was being systematically destroyed by claws that could tear through aluminum sheeting like paper. The great animal seemed to understand that helicopters were vulnerable to damage, focusing its attack on engines and flight controls. The circling helicopter immediately descended to engage this new threat, its door gunner opening fire with a mounted machine gun. But shooting at a moving target from an unstable platform was far more difficult than training scenarios suggested, and most of the rounds went wide or struck the already destroyed aircraft on the ground. Lije used the distraction to position himself for the final attack. The descending helicopter was focused entirely on the bear, its crew trying to eliminate what they saw as the primary threat. They never saw the second explosive charge until it was too late. The device struck the helicopter's engine compartment and detonated with devastating effect. The aircraft didn't crash so much as disintegrate, raining burning debris across the clearing in a spectacular display of destruction that illuminated the entire valley. Sudden silence returned to the mountains, broken only by the crackling of flames and the distant sound of wind through the pines. 3 military helicopters had been destroyed in less than an hour by an old soldier and a wounded bear, using nothing but tactical knowledge and improvised weapons. The bear approached Lije through the wreckage, its fur singed by burning debris but otherwise unharmed. The great animal was breathing heavily from exertion, but its dark eyes held satisfaction rather than exhaustion. They had fought together and won together, proving that partnership could overcome superior numbers and equipment. "Not bad for an amateur," Lije said, patting the bear's massive shoulder. "Though next time, maybe wait for the signal before charging into machine gun fire." The bear made a soft chuffing sound that might have been amusement, then turned to survey the destruction they'd created. Burning helicopter wreckage illuminated the clearing like a bonfire, sending smoke and sparks spiraling up toward the star-filled sky. But the battle wasn't over yet. Carson was still alive somewhere in the mountains, along with whatever personnel he'd held in reserve. The man would be reassessing his situation now, realizing that his carefully planned operation had become a disaster of epic proportions. Radio chatter from the surviving equipment confirmed Lije's assessment. Carson's voice, strained and desperate, was calling for immediate extraction and reinforcement. The wildlife trafficking operation was finished, but the man behind it wasn't ready to accept defeat. "This isn't over." Carson's amplified voice echoed across the valley. "I know who you are now, and I know how to find you. This mountain won't protect you forever." Lije picked up one of the intact radios and keyed the microphone. "You're right," he said calmly. "It's not over. But you're wrong about one thing. I'm not hiding behind this mountain. I am this mountain. And mountains don't run from men who hurt the creatures that live on them." The bear rumbled its agreement, a sound that carried clearly over the radio frequency. Carson's silence suggested he was beginning to understand exactly what kind of enemy he'd made. The final confrontation was still coming, but the balance of power had shifted decisively. The hunters had become the hunted, and the mountain was about to claim its own. 3 days after the helicopters burned, Lee found Carson's body at the bottom of Widow's Creek Ravine, 50 miles from where the battle had ended. The professional tracker had tried to escape on foot through terrain he didn't understand, making the kind of mistakes that killed people in the mountains. Hypothermia had taken him some time during the second night, leaving him curled beneath a granite overhang like he was sleeping. There was no satisfaction in the discovery, only the quiet completion of something that had needed finishing. Carson had been a professional doing a job, but the job itself had been rotten from the start. Now it was over, and the mountains could return to their ancient rhythms without interference from men who saw wildlife as commodities to be harvested. The bear was waiting when Lije returned to the cabin, lying in its favorite spot beside the fireplace. The great animal's injured leg had healed cleanly over the past weeks. though it would always carry scars from the steel trap that had brought them together. Those marks seemed fitting, somehow proof that some wounds could be survived. That damage didn't have to define you. Found him, Lije said, settling into his chair with a cup of coffee. He won't be bothering anyone anymore. The bear made a soft rumbling sound that might have been acknowledgement or sympathy. Since Carson's organization had collapsed, the great animal had grown more relaxed, spending its days exploring the valley and returning each evening to share the warmth of the cabin. It was an arrangement that suited them both: companionship without constraints, partnership without ownership. Federal agents had arrived a week after the battle, drawn by reports of helicopter crashes and missing persons. Lije had told them enough truth to satisfy their investigation: a wildlife trafficking ring, armed confrontation, self-defense, while leaving out details that would have complicated everyone's lives. The agents had seemed relieved to close the case without extensive paperwork or jurisdictional disputes. They'd also brought news that Carson's organization had been larger than anyone suspected. Connections to overseas wildlife smuggling, political corruption, money laundering through legitimate businesses. The man's death had unraveled a network that spanned 3 countries and involved millions of dollars in illegal trade. Sometimes one thread, pulled at the right moment, could bring down an entire tapestry of corruption. Now, as spring began to soften the high country snow, Lije found himself thinking about the future in ways he hadn't for 15 years. The bear's presence had changed something fundamental in his relationship with isolation. Solitude was still valuable, but it didn't have to mean disconnection from all living things. Some connections were worth the risk of pain. He'd started corresponding with Tommy Nguyen, the soldier from his Vietnam unit who'd lost his leg to a mine. Tommy's letters spoke of teaching students who reminded him why the world was worth protecting, of finding purpose in nurturing rather than destroying. There was wisdom in those words that Lije was finally ready to hear. The bear stirred beside the fireplace and moved to the window, looking out at the valley with obvious contentment. Spring was bringing new growth to the meadows, wildflowers pushing through the retreating snow in explosions of color that had no names. Life returning to the high country with the patient persistence that had sustained it through countless winters. Thinking about staying? Lije asked, though he already knew the answer. The bear turned from the window and settled back beside the fire, its dark eyes reflecting flames that would burn through many more evenings. The great animal had found something here to not just shelter from a hostile world, but partnership with someone who understood that survival was easier when shared. Outside, an eagle circled over the valley on thermal currents that carried the scent of pine and snowmelt and the promise of summer warmth. The mountains endured as they always had, indifferent to human plans but protective of those who learned to live within their rhythms. Some sanctuaries had to be earned through suffering, defended through courage, and maintained through wisdom. In the distance, a wolf howled not in loneliness, but in celebration of territory reclaimed and pack bonds strengthened. The sound echoed off granite peaks and pine-covered ridges, a wild song that spoke of things older than civilization and more enduring than any human enterprise. Lije reached out and placed his hand on the bear's massive shoulder, feeling the steady heartbeat beneath thick fur. 2 creatures who had found each other when they needed it most, who had learned that redemption sometimes came in the most unexpected forms. The steel trap that had nearly killed them, both had instead forged a bond stronger than the metal that had tried to contain it. The fire crackled softly in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on log walls that had sheltered them through the hardest winter either had known. But spring was coming to the high country, bringing new possibilities and the promise that some wounds could heal completely when given enough time and the right kind of care. Sometimes the hardest battles we fight aren't against enemies, but against the parts of ourselves we're trying to forget. Sometimes redemption comes from the most unexpected places, when we least deserve it, but need it most. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we find that saving another creature is the same as saving ourselves. The bear's rumbling contentment filled the cabin like a lullaby, a sound that spoke of peace earned through struggle and trust built through shared danger. Outside, the mountain night settled over the valley with the quiet benediction of snow and starlight, protecting all who understood that some sanctuaries were worth any price to preserve. In the morning, there would be new tracks in the snow deer, and elk returning to meadows that had been empty, wolves reclaiming territory that had been abandoned, life flowing back into places where it belonged. The mountain was healing, and so were its unlikely guardians. The last entry in Lije's journal that night was simple. Some traps are meant to be broken. Some souls are meant to be free. And some partnerships transcend every boundary that men try to build between themselves and the wild world that shaped them. The bear slept beside the dying fire, its breathing deep and peaceful. And for the first time in 15 years, Lije Calder slept without dreams of war, his rest guarded by a friend who had taught him that courage comes in many forms. But the greatest courage is the willingness to trust again when trust has been broken, to hope again when hope seems foolish, and to love again when love means risking everything you fought to protect. The mountains kept their eternal watch, and all was well in the high country where snow never quite melts and the silence runs deeper than most men can bear. Some stories end with battles won or enemies defeated. The best stories end with damaged souls finding their way back to wholeness, discovering that redemption often wears fur and walks on four legs, offering the kind of unconditional acceptance that humans spend lifetimes seeking. The steel trap lay rusted and forgotten in the clearing, where it had failed to hold what was meant to be free. Spring would cover it with new growth, and eventually the forest would reclaim it entirely. But the bond it had inadvertently created would endure longer than metal, stronger than any chain that men could forge. In the end, that was the only victory that truly mattered. Two trapped souls setting each other free, and finding in that freedom something worth protecting for as long as the mountains themselves shall stand.